presenting today. And your presentation is called Towards Zero Waste, an ethnographic study of infrastructure and waste-related education in Sumbawa, Indonesia. Thank you, Lukas.
Thank you. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. The aim of this presentation is to introduce my research project. I'll also try to share some early findings from the project, and I will outline how my fragmented data on the development of waste management infrastructure and waste-related education in Sumbawa may be organized into a conceptual and analytic framework of re-evaluation, reassembling, and transformation. You may be wondering what are the two logos displayed on the slide. This is to acknowledge that my fieldwork was conducted in the permission from the Indonesian Ministry of Research and Technology, and also in collaboration with the University of Mataram. Got quite a lot of pictures too. There's not much text in the presentation. So if I were to show this image to someone, let's say my mother, I think she would just say that it's strange. However, in our disciplines, we suspend judgment. And instead, when confronted with such mess, we ask, how can this be? Or more precisely, what would the world have to be in order for this to be so? This picture was taken in a coastal village on the island of Sumbawa, where I lived for 6 months as part of my fieldwork, and from where I traveled to other sites relevant to my research. Thus, I can say that similar images could be taken almost anywhere in Indonesia, including urban or tourist areas. So to be able to answer the question, how can this be, I had to try to understand the life world in which I was dwelling, as inhabited by both human and non-human beings. I'm including the non-human beings here not so as to acknowledge the presence of the goat, but to acknowledge that the waste in which the goat stands and from where it eats is not only the result of specific social relations, of, for that matter, the lack of thereof, but also of people's relations to waste and to the natural environment. To understand the multidimensional nature of waste in Indonesia requires a multidimensional approach. So let us look at some useful anthropological approaches to waste. First is the symbolic structural approach, which asks why different things are considered waste or polluting in different cultures. The answer to this is the specific classificatory systems in which understanding of waste are embedded. In other words, there is nothing intrinsically polluting about waste, for there is no waste in nature. In this instance, waste is just a reflection of culture rather than something that directly shapes human life. However, it is the system that shapes human life and therefore determines, for example, why some people are left to do cleaning and polluting jobs. The economic materialist approach to waste, as the name suggests, is less concerned with the people and more so with the actual materials and their value. For this approach, waste, or more precisely rubbish, is not out of place, but rather in the right place, literally in a bin, because it has no value. However, it may have value in the future. This approach shifts attention to global flows of waste, as well as to the ways in which waste can be extracted from its classification and become something of value. However, waste is not only something that people make, it is also something that makes people. It is the intersubjective post-human approach to waste that focuses on how identities and relationships are created through direct association with waste. This approach is in line with actor network theory, which does not conceive of action and agency as exclusively human faculties. In other words, waste materials also have the capacity to make others act. What I want to note here is that the study of waste management has to consider all three approaches to waste. To make a general assessment from which my research departs, the reasons for which Indonesia is now ranked as the world's second biggest marine polluter should be read against the following three backdrops. First is the limited environmental awareness and the distinct perceptions of waste among the populace. Second, its rapid spread of retail infrastructure and the resulting shift in consumption practices from biodegradable to plastic materials. And finally, the lack of waste management infrastructure. Here I should also include lack of another infrastructure, mainly the absence of government supply of drinking water. This, of course, means that many of the waterways in Indonesia are filled with plastic bottles. This is why many non-governmental organizations that provide environmental and waste-related education to school children in Indonesia often also supply educators and their students with water filters and reusable water bottle seen on the picture. For my thesis, there's three independent variables will make my first analytic chapter. However, in this presentation, I will only look at the distinct perceptions of waste, plastic consumption, and infrastructure. With respect to the first variable, the most important thing to highlight is the culture-specific notion of clean lines and its two main characteristics. First, it focuses predominantly on the social environment. The house, mosque, body, and its attire and soul, all theirs have to be clean for the eyes of the other, which includes the guest, but also Allah himself. For clean lines is part of faith. The notion of clean lines is important and something that children themselves have to learn in schools, in the schools. In the thematic book, Clean and Healthy Life for Primary School Children, this notion of clean lines is explored through a variety of spaces, namely classrooms, bedrooms, playgrounds, markets, and public toilets. The book's only reference to the natural environment explores clean lines in a botanical garden. The second characteristic of clean lines is that its main guardians and doers are women. To litter or to make waste in or outside of the house is not a problem, because, as many of my informants told me, there will always be some designated person who will clean it up. That is certainly the case in the sphere of household, where mothers, sisters, or wives constitute such personnel. I will give some examples in terms of gender, but my research also considers intergenerational relations, especially so in relation to communal spaces. In terms of clean lines, I examined how waste is produced and handled across the three spheres of household, subsistence economy, and communal life. I was fortunate that the subsistence economy of people in the village where I lived was seaweed cultivation, which allowed me to get a good view into all three spheres. This is because seaweed is harvested in the sea, it is dried on the beach or by the side of the road, and it is cleaned and processed in the household. When in the sea, moss grows around the seaweed, sometimes affecting negatively its growth. At this stage, moss is seen as a nuisance or a weed when compared to aquaculture crop. When seaweed is harvested, men take it from the sea onto the beach where women start the drying process. At this stage, moss becomes nothing but waste because it has no value. So at this stage, large pieces of moss that can be separated from the seaweed are simply left alone on the beach or sidewalk as seen in the picture. Of course, like during any other work, people need to eat and drink and just produce other waste, also, as you can also see in the picture. However, there is still lots of moss that cannot be separated until the seaweed is dried. When dried, seaweed is often taken into the household where women and/or young girls would sit in circle to do the time-consuming and dialogue-generating work of separating dried moss from dried seaweed. During this cleaning work, women give seaweed its value and therefore reproduce the household itself. The separated moss is then handled like any other household waste. Having to balance the cleaning of seaweed and the cleaning of household at the same time, many of my female informants say that it would be nice to have a maid, which of course many households in Indonesia do have, especially so in urban areas. So this brings me to the second variable, which is consumption and shift from biodegradable to plastic materials. When I said earlier that there is no waste in nature, I refer to the fact that waste is produced by culture, but also because most of the actual waste that people produced, at least until the second half of the 20th century, was just a degrading carbon. It is different today in that plastic waste takes longer than natural byproducts to decompose. Its tonnage, toxicity, and heterogeneity makes plastic waste the signature of Anthropocene. In other words, plastic and plastic waste are not a culture-specific issue, but rather a planetary one. In the village where I lived, young children often participate in seaweed cultivation, often by helping to clean dried seaweed. By doing so, they not only learn about entrepreneurial skills or the rhythms of aquaculture, but they also participate or learn to participate in consumption. They earn money that they can spend on objects that take 5 seconds to consume and years to decompose. Plastic is modernity and it makes life possible. For example, in case of seaweed cultivation, people are using plastic strings to tie seaweed onto the ropes that are then planted in the sea, as you can see in the picture. When plastic is discarded, it is not seen as a problem, certainly not for people who discard it. For seaweed cultivators, for example, the #1 waste, as I already explained, is moss. The majority of plastic waste that does not find its way into landfill is either burned or made to continue its life in the ocean. The rest is picked up by those who make a living from it. The recyclable waste that is rescued by informal waste pickers can only be recycled when clean and stripped of labels and other non-recyclable pollutants. This again is done by women who give it new value by sitting together in circles. This picture was taken on the island of Java, and the women depicted there are cleaning plastic waste that has been imported from Sumbawa. Some of that waste may have come from the household of my informants, but also from me. The trucks that transport the cubes of pressed waste from Sumbawa to Java are not returning empty-handed. Instead, they are coming back filled with sugary drinks. The important thing to note here is that the introduction of plastic and the growth of retail infrastructure has not been accompanied by education about the negative effects that plastic materials and their production, including recycling, have on the environment. Most importantly, these changes have not been matched by the strengthening of waste management infrastructure, which now brings me to the final variable. The main reason why people in both rural and urban areas in Indonesia bury or throw away their waste is because they have no access to waste management infrastructure. Like waste itself, waste management infrastructure in Indonesia has not been a priority. The model that Indonesia has been using focuses predominantly on the downstream sphere of waste management, that is on landfills. However insufficient or environmentally problematic landfills are, their use in Indonesia is often reserved only for waste that has been collected from nearby cities or villages that have access to main road. Waste that is collected from schools, offices, households, and the likes is never separated. In most cases, separating of waste occurs only at the landfill. And again, it's mainly women who resurrect recyclable materials there. However, it is important to note that waste management is not only something that women do. Here is an image of an urban dweller whose household is not adjacent to the main road. So once a week, he drives to landfill to dispose of his family's household waste. Also, all the truck drivers and municipal waste collectors are male, as well as the people who operate heavy machinery in the informal recycling sector, as you can see in the picture. Excuse me, a lot of words. I will now look at how to structure the remaining parts of my thesis into three analytic categories of re-evaluation, reassembling, and transformation, or if I stretch it, into reduce, reuse, recycle, the famous 3R slogan of many waste policies. The volume, toxicity, and the heterogeneity of municipal solid waste, as well as its effect on local environment, motivate people in Indonesia and its government to act. In 2017, President Jokowi pledged to reduce marine plastic debris by 70% and to slash total waste production by 30% by 2025. How could this be achieved? Well, local commentators and politicians all recognize that the issue of waste cannot be addressed by infrastructure alone, but also by education. They also argue that the conceptualization of waste management in Indonesia has to move beyond the dominant focus on engineering and technology. Their concerns are similar to those voiced by scholars in the anthropology of infrastructure, who reminds us that infrastructures have both social and technical aspects. In other words, they prompt us to consider not only the infrastructures of steel and concrete, but also those of flesh and blood. By acknowledging both aspects, my research considered waste management infrastructure not only as matter that moves and transforms other matter, but also as that which moves and is moved, or for that matter, unmoved by culture. In 2019, the government of Western Nusa Tenggara, or NTB as it's also known, announced its own provincial waste management program, whose aim is to achieve by 2023 70% management and 30% reduction of its waste. The plan to achieve this objective is known as NTB Zero Waste 2023. The polysemic nature of the term zero waste suggests that case study research is required to understand how this heterogeneous global community of practice is interpreted and played out in given context. Moreover, the notion of zero waste ought to be a useful concept through which to invite and probe the environmental. In this case, I would first introduce the concept of zero waste and give examples from elsewhere, and then outline the plans of the government of NTB. I mean, not in this context, sorry, in the first chapter, in the first section of the second chapter. To this, I would like to add that it was not my intention to focus on zero waste when I embarked on my fieldwork. However, having been recalled back to Perth earlier than expected, I have now turned to zero waste as something but not only informs the developments that I observed in Sumbawa, but also as something that I can explore from Perth by looking at both local policies and the wider global discourse on zero waste. Zero waste is not a literal target, at least not in the context of my research. The aim of zero waste program is to reduce the amount of waste going into landfills and leaking into the environment by turning waste into something of value. As the vice governor of As the vice governor of Entebbe noted, waste cannot be seen as a problem. Instead, it has to be managed as a blessing. In a brief, what is being revalued here in order to reduce waste is not only waste itself, but also waste management infrastructure and people's relations to and their role in that infrastructure. I don't refer only to the ways in which people are invited to act on and with infrastructure or newly installed bins, but more to people's active role in the infrastructure itself. This can be seen most clearly in a way that government agencies encourage the establishment of community-based waste banks and other waste processing facilities. There is a plan to have one waste bank in every village or urban neighborhood. The model is that waste bank operators would buy recyclable waste from their fellow villagers and then sell it for recycling. In order to materialize this cognitive revaluation of both waste and waste management infrastructure, people, things, and ideas have to be mobilized and assembled. In this instance, I consider zero waste as an assemblage. I use the term reassembling or reuse because what is being assembled is not a new, but rather that which already exists or has previously not been considered directly in relation to waste management. This includes various policies as well as different normative practices. In this chapter, I will look at the orderings that take place across the lineal axis of upstream and downstream spheres of waste management, or if you like, between society and infrastructure. This will include various community-based waste management facilities, cleanup activities, and waste-related pedagogies, but also various innovative technologies and plans to build new and improve existing landfills. I will use the concept of people as infrastructure, coined by Simon, to examine social relations, namely state, society, and youth community relations. I will examine the variety of ways in which people are recruited or recruit themselves into infrastructure. This will include socialization events, innovation fairs and competitions, character education, religious rhetoric, as well as youth policies and entrepreneurialism. However, zero waste is also a de-assembling concept because the materialization of any ordering proposed by such assemblage will inevitably go hand in hand with marginalization, erasure, and even destruction of others. In the second part of this chapter, I will look at the people, things, and ideas that are not being mobilized or reused as part of this ordering. This will include policies that ignore and ultimately try to do without the informal waste collecting sector. It could be said that this sector is often regarded as a threat and a nuisance to order and beauty. In this instance, the Entebbe Zero Waste program may attempt not only to make the province free of rubbish, but also free from scavengers and waste collectors. Another example of this exclusion would be teaching about consumption and or prohibiting littering, as well as the lack of references about the negative effects of burning. Because burning waste essentially is another means to achieve the reduction of waste. And finally, the third chapter would be about transformation. I could also use the term recycling because the efforts described thus far speak of opportunity, but at the same time are being hampered by various limitations. In brief, this chapter will analyze the educational aptitudes, socio-material innovations, and enactments of care and cooperation that arise as part of the Zero Waste program. But it will also highlight the failures and contingent events that arise when the efforts to tame waste and to increase environmental awareness are met and informed by existing social hierarchies and distinct perceptions of waste, consumption, and human nature relations. In a sense, this chapter will draw on some of the findings from the first chapter, especially the notion of clean lines, the delegation of responsibility, and the focus on the aesthetic as opposed to something more intrinsic. I will also examine the materiality of waste and the instability and unsustainability of trying to transform waste materials into something useful, let alone profitable. I will also look at the limitations of neoliberal waste management infrastructure. In other words, the limits of trying to transform people into entrepreneurial subjects. Briefly, in conclusion, I would like to add that my intention to combine study of infrastructure and environmental education, more specifically base management and base-related education, is twofold. First, anthropologists have long acknowledged the dual capacity of infrastructure to both enchant and infuriate, which indicates that engagement with infrastructure have the potential to promote knowledge about environmental challenges, cultivate democratic culture, and encourage active citizenship. Second, infrastructural developments such as those I observed in my field site provide opportunity to examine how knowledge about the environment and our responsibility to and for it is produced, disseminated, and contested across various interconnected scales that span beyond the strictly delineated sites of formal schooling. And I think that's it. Here, I just want to acknowledge, I invited my supervisor from Indonesia to join us today, but I hope he was just busy rather than not able to log in. Thank you. I think that's.
Thank you, Lukas.